Hello there, Jackson here from Modal Electronics, and I am kind of excited today because we're going to talk about the oscillator section on ARGON8. And the reason why I'm excited is because there are a load of really unique features in this oscillator section which you aren't going to find on other synthesizers. And if you're not familiar with wavetable synths, there's a whole bunch of stuff here which is just going to blow your mind. You're going to be really excited by. So we're going to jump in first by learning what each of the functions in the oscillator section does. And then we're going to talk more about these kind of unique relationships between tune and the osc mods and what you can do with the wave shapes, and kind of I might throw you some useful modulations as well, things that are nice to modulate within the oscillator section. So first and foremost, we're just going to look at the functions. So this is the oscillator section here, comprised of these 8 encoders and these 4 push buttons here. And you'll notice that they all have multiple functions silkscreened underneath them. The blue functions are accessed by pressing or holding shift. So you can press shift to latch it, or you can hold it to use it momentarily and it will return to the normal state. So that's how we navigate the section, and everything else on the synthesizer you'll notice is color coded anytime there is another function. So that is just basic navigation 101 to begin with. We're going to start off by looking at this wave section here. So we have wave 1, tune 2 and wave 2. So it's a mirror of 2 sides here of exactly the same function. So we're just going to concentrate here on wave 1. The wave function. So ARGON8 is a wavetable synthesizer. It's an 8-voice polyphonic wavetable synthesizer. And what that means is we have these shapes that we can scan through seamlessly. So but we aren't limited to these shapes. So these are your standard kind of analog wave shapes. You have a sine, a triangle, a square, and a sawtooth wave. But we have loads more to play with here. This is the beautiful thing about wavetable synthesizers, is that you have a huge palette of sounds that you can draw from. So with ARGON8, we have 24 banks available here. So we can scan through them by holding or pressing shift and changing the wave encoder here. And once we've chosen one, we can scan through it there. Let's just take the chord invert off there. So this is really lovely. We can scan through all these different wave shapes, and we've got these 2 functions here. We can scan through them, we can choose different wave banks, but there is one more thing we can do here. We can hold the patch button and we can change the WAV mod, which is applied to each oscillator. You can see here for wave 1 and wave 2, we have independent WAV mods. This is something we're going to come back to later, but this is a really unique function and something that you're not going to find elsewhere, which adds just another layer of complexity to this synthesizer. And it's just another beautiful rabbit hole to go down when you're kind of deciding what to do with your oscillators and kind of what sounds you want to make. This just opens up a whole nother playground for you to explore. So we'll come back to that. But the next thing you're going to notice here is we have the tune. So obviously we can tune in semitones. Or we can tune in cents. So I think you can go plus or minus 50 cents there. And obviously we can make those decisions for each of these sections. So you can have independent tuning, independent wave banks, independent wave shapes, and independent WAV mods for each of those sections. You can imagine just the amount of combinations of all of those things. It's up in the thousands with the different combinations of things here going on. So there's a huge amount with this synthesizer that you, if you have time to explore it all, that you can get out of it, which is really great. So the next thing that we're going to move on to is the spread function here, and this is how we detune the oscillators. When we talk about synthesizers, we talk about voices and oscillators, and this is an 8-voice synthesizer with 32 oscillators. So what that means is we have 2 oscillators per wave section per note. So when I play all 8 notes, if I go, I now have 16 oscillators on the left and 16 oscillators on the right. So if I mix them in, and you can hear the spread actually moves them in pitch away from each other, and we start to get this luscious chorusing happening, and this movement starts to occur. So this is what spread's traditionally used for. One thing that we do on our products is that when we achieve a full kind of spread detune here, once we pass that point, we actually begin to snap those oscillators into intervals, into useful intervals. So this is another kind of key trick to sound design with these synthesizers. You have this really nice ability to kind of make more of the oscillator section, whereas we only have 2 kind of wave sections to play with here. We can actually split it and break it into much more, which is a very, very cool thing to have. Underneath that we have the glide. So if I use shift and I put this one in here, I'm just going to go onto mono for this. So glide enables us to have the notes travel to meet each other, and we have glide in both directions, so that can be fingered or unfingered. I'm not sure what the right way to put that is. So that's the glide function. Obviously we have the mix between the oscillators here, and this one's quite crucial to me because one thing that I like to do, and that I'm going to show you in a minute, is to mix only oscillator 1 and use oscillator 2 to affect this in a way that, yeah, we kind of get to keep these characteristics. This nice clean sine wave, for example, we'd be able to keep that there, and we'd be able to impart some harshness from, you know, a different wavetable here. We'd be able to kind of just give a little bit of that color, that character to this wave. So mix is a really integral part of the oscillator section, and is kind of often overlooked. People often will just slap it straight into the middle and leave it there and not think about it. But especially with wavetable synthesizers and things that can do, you know, for example, things like phase modulation, ring mods, sync, and all these things, this is kind of crucial. So I'm going to start off by showing you, well, actually, I'm just going to show you something nice that we can do with tune, something really, really simple. If you don't know about it, it's a nice thing to learn. So I'm just going to go for sawtooths on both sides here. Boom, boom, sawtooths. So showing you how important tune is to get some movement. We're not using the spread function to get movement here. We're not using the LFOs. This is just the tuning of the waves beating against each other, and this is a really, really classic sound. This is a re, so just to demonstrate the importance of tuning before we move on to the OSC mods. And the reason why I'm talking about tuning is because when we talk about things like phase modulation, which is kind of very, very similar to frequency modulation, they're essentially the same thing. They just have slightly different way of working things out, I think. When we talk about these things, the most critical part of making those sounds and making them what they are is the pitch ratio between the oscillators. So what I'm going to set up here is kind of a classic bass sound to begin with. So we have our sine wave. So there's a nice bass sound. And I'm not going to mix in wave 2, but just so you can hear what I'm doing before I do, I'm going to put this one up an octave. So this is kind of the basis of many kind of UK dance music basses. There's a lot of garage and a lot of drum and bass and even dubstep, which is kind of reliant entirely on this technique. And when I start to move the pitch around here, you really start to understand what the importance of these ratios are, especially when it comes to phase modulation. So that was some phase modulation, and I just showed you how the relationships between the pitch really drastically affect the sound. You can go from this really nice dark kind of bass, growly kind of this growing in harmonic kind of content to this just really wild and bizarre, just LFO dancing kind of sound. It's very, very, very bizarre. But you can use this to your advantage when it comes to using different waves to kind of give a really, really aggressive tone. So if I wasn't just using sine waves here, and let's say, for example, we'd picked one of the 002 waves here for wave 2. You can see how you get this whole texture of sounds opening up, and this again is just using the mix on 1, so all of this character is ending up on wave 1 via the OSC mod. So this is why this is such a huge part of the sound of ARGON8, because you can do some really, really wild things with this. And it's not just phase modulation that we have access to here. We've got 8 different OSC mods to choose from, so we can do ring modulation, amp modulation. There's 3 different types of sync, or two types of sync, sorry. There is a shaper, an inverter, and sync ring mod, which is a combination of sync and ring mod. So we have a lot to choose from here, and they all have completely different sounds and characteristics. So hard sync, for example. And then we've got windowed sync, which you can hear is much, much smoother. So it fades kind of where the wave is being stretched with sync. It fades those points that kind of fall over the 0 crossover point there. It fades them back to 0. So we get this beautiful smooth sync happening. So that's lovely. What we're going to look at next is these voice modes down here. So I keep flipping between these different voice modes and going on mono to show you glide, and I'm just going to go back onto poly at the moment just so that we can see the difference. So what we have is the kind of traditional voice modes. We've got monophonic, we've got polyphonic, and we have unison. Now there's a few different types of unison. We've got 2, 4 and 8, and what that means is how many notes are stacked up. So you have either 2 notes, 4 notes, or all 8 notes as if they're being played at once. And this is kind of the traditional things, but we also have this stack mode here, and what this allows us to do is to get some of the magic of the kind of unison mode and actually be able to play polyphonically with it. So we have a stack 2, which allows us to play 4 notes because it's basically doubling up. So I press 1 and it's 2 notes. They're both spread out left and right. So here, if I'm on poly, the voices dance between left and right, they alternate between left and right. And if I go to stack, you can't quite hear it yet, but they're on both sides and they're equal. So the way that I can kind of expose these oscillators now, just leave that on sustain, is to give a little bit of voice drift. So what happens here, much like the spread, the sound starts to become detuned by random amounts. So all of the oscillators are slightly different to each other, and every time I press a note, they're being allocated a different amount to be kind of off by, if that makes sense. So we get this really kind of luscious modulation going, and when we have the width like we have now at kind of full intensity, which is really, really beautiful. And this is one of the ways we can give more character to this sound, because we can go from having really kind of straight down the center mono sounds to having these sounds that then start to dance in the stereo field. And when you start to, for example, use mid-side processing, or you start to play a little bit more with what you can do within the stereo field, this becomes a super, super interesting tool to have in your arsenal, because it can do so much in the stereo field. So this is why the stack modes are quite a powerful, unique feature to our synthesizers, and something you should probably check out. So we have stack 2 and we also have stack 4, which will allow us to do just 2 notes. So you have 4 notes sounding at once, essentially. So it's just a little bit richer. There are just more notes happening there. So that runs over all of the voice modes for you. I'm going to look into now some of the more interesting features in, for example, the spread mode. So we're going to make a couple of patches now. So we're going to go back to load up an initialize patch, and we're going to do some exploration, and I'm going to look at some of the WAV mods and how we can finish off a sound there. So I'm going to begin by trying to make a kind of electric piano approximation using the FM. Okay, so we've got a really basic sound going on here. What I'm going to show you now is how we can finish this off with the WAV mods. So we have this nice oscillator modifier with some phase mod going on here, which has got quite a high ratio. So 2 octaves above wave 1 is being triggered by this mod EG to scan through this OSC mod. So okay, so we're going to put some of the WAV mods on now. So you can see there's a huge amount of options we have here. We've got 32 WAV mods that you can choose for each wave. And there I was putting it onto wave 1. And I was saying earlier about mixing only on wave 1, this kind of way that we're doing at the moment. The reason why I was doing it on wave 1 there was to show you how it's really quickly roughing up the sound, because that's our eventual output. And it roughs up things really, really quickly. But if we have it only on wave 2, we're only going to be affecting the kind of attack portion of this sound because of the mod envelope assignment that we made. We're only going to be affecting that first attack bit. So I can make this kind of rough digital piano, but I can keep this really nice clean sine wave. So I'm going to show you this now. This is kind of a nice tip when you're using this technique, mixing only on wave 1. So we're going to apply some of the WAV mods to wave 2. We don't hear anything we don't hear anything at first because and obviously we have the chord invert, which I was playing with earlier, which is accessed the same way as the WAV mods are. We hold pitch and we turn this mod encoder here with the drift and the width on it. So I just captured a chord here. This is moving on to some of these other performance functions we've got here. We've got octave plus and minus, so we can change the octave of the keyboard here. We have a transpose function. This one's a nice one. So if I, for example, have an arpeggiator, let's just set an arpeggiator going. I can use this transpose function. So I've just captured a chord here, and I'm going to go over some of the performance functions. So we looked at the chord invert there, but we also have this transpose function. So I've recorded in some chords into the sequencer here, and I'm just going to cycle through them by pressing the keys here. So you can see how we can use the transpose function in conjunction with either, the arpeggiator, the sequencer, or any of the notes that you are feeding into the synthesizer, and any notes that you're playing on the keyboard as well. Obviously, this is quite a cool little function to have, especially when you're doing performance stuff. So especially when you're using the sequencer, it's a really, really nice function to have to kind of switch things up a little bit. This just about ties things up for the performance features and things. I'm just going to quickly talk about some nice modulations that I like to make within the oscillator section. One of the most key ones that I do, I'm not sure whether it will work with this kind of electronic keys patch that we've got going on here, but one of the nice things that I do quite frequently is to use velocity to manner of different things, but often to the wave shapes. So what this does is the harder I press or the faster that I press, it will choose a point in the wavetable. So if it's completely the softest velocity, so velocity of 1, it will be all the way on a sine wave. And as I start to press harder velocities, it progresses through the wave shapes. Obviously this is quite drastic, but this kind of gives you an idea of one of the kind of common things that I do. And I'll use velocity to a whole bunch of different destinations, really commonly to the filter depth, different parts of the waves, and tuning as well to make things a little bit more bizarre is kind of often found in the patches in ARGON8. So that's something nice that you can do. Another thing that's really useful is actually using the joystick to, for example, you could use it to go through the spread. There's a few functions where if there's some interesting spread, we could, for example, use the Y plus to change that there. But actually, one of my favorite assignments is just to have them to the waves, and one that I would do quite often. So if I just remove this Y plus to spread, I'm actually going to do that to wave 1, and I'm going to choose Y minus to wave 2 in the same direction. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to change this guy to wave 1, and I'm going to go for mod slot 4 to spread to oscillator wave 1, and then I'm going to go mod slot 5, mod slot 3, hello to oscillator 1 wave. I'm going to go here, I'm going to choose, actually I'm just going to do it straight up, we'll go minus wave 2. There we go. So we can do some really cool things with the performance functions and tying different modulation sources to parts of the oscillator section. So what we've looked at initially is using the mod EG to control OSC-mod. We have used the joystick to control the wave directions. We've used the velocity to control the wave shape as well. One of the other cool things that we can do, I'm going to go back to an initial patch here. One of the cool things that we can do as well is use the LFOs to control the tune. Now this is a bit of a weird one to do, but we're just going to go with it anyway. So we're just going to do a little bit to here. And let's increase the rate. And we'll do this guy over here. Let's just go the whole amount and see what happens. Oof. So now I'm mixing only on one. So there we have it, some crazy stuff there. We can see how we can use the oscillator section to our advantage and how the tuning relationships and oscillator modifiers that we're using and, you know, all the other decisions like the spread and the drift really impact the sound, the kind of stereo field and the character. It's all buried within this oscillator section. So once you get your head around this, wavetable synthesis is kind of at your fingertips, and sound design especially becomes a lot more fluid and a lot more exploratory, which is great. It's kind of the point that everybody wants to get to, where you can kind of turn your mind off and just explore. This is one of the really good tools that I have that I can do this with, so it's one that I'm really happy to be showing off at the moment. And I would encourage all of you guys who've got an ARGON8 to spend a bit of time just in the oscillator section. Forget about your filters, forget about the effects and all the other cool things that we've got to play with, and just bury your head in the oscillator section for a little while, and I promise it will be rewarding.